When describing metafictional video games, the most famous and well-known is the Stanley Parable. Self-described as not a game that you play, but a game that plays you. The Stanley Parable acts as a dissection of the structure of video games through a dramatic technique known as theatre of the absurd. The game is also a critique on player choice and includes many indirect, extra-compositional meta-references to comment on the nature of free will in games. Furthermore, the Stanley Parable analyzes the nature of video games as both an art form and the industry's corporate practices through the use of meta-referencing and humor, critiquing its impact on the industry.
This is the story of a man named Stanley. When Stanley came to a set of 2 open doors, he entered the door on his left. This was not the correct way to the meeting room, and Stanley knew it perfectly well. Perhaps he wanted to stop by the employee lounge first, just to admire it.
Yes, truly a room worth admiring. It had really been worth the detour after all. But eager to get back to business, Stanley took the first open door on his left.
Stanley was so bad at following directions, it's incredible he wasn't fired years ago. Look, Stanley, I think perhaps we've gotten off on the wrong foot here. I realize that investing your trust in someone else can be difficult, but the fact is that the story has been about nothing but you all this time.
What? Really?
My story? You've destroyed my work! We just need to get you home as soon as possible before the narrative contradiction gets any worse.
When Stanley... Wait, what?
Are you that convinced that I want something bad to happen to you?
Psst. Stanley!
Stanley was fat and ugly and really stupid. Also, Stanley is addicted to drugs and hookers.
Okay, yep, it's worse.
You see? There's nothing here. I haven't even finished building this section of the map, because you were never supposed to be here in the first place. Broken rooms, exposed developer textures. Is this what you had wanted? Was it worth ruining the entire story I had written out specifically for you? Do you not think I put a lot of time into that? Because I did.
The theatre of the absurd is a type of post-World War II fiction that incorporates absurdist and existential plot threads. In a journal article titled Paradox and Pedagogy in the Stanley Parable, Antranik Sarian describes this concept as odd, minimalistic stories between a small set of characters, where both characters are defined by each other's existence. Ideas such as cycles, loops, and existentialism are also common themes in plays such as Samuel Beckett's Endgame, which is an absurdist tragic comedy about 2 characters defined by their illogical bantering while struggling to find meaning in the post-apocalypse.
Your dogs are here.
He's white, isn't he?
Nearly.
What do you mean nearly? Is he white or isn't he?
He isn't.
You've forgotten the sex.
The play confounds the audience by forcing them to create their own interpretations. Both of these elements help define the movement of the theatre of the absurd. The Stanley Parable utilizes this dramatic element through each playthrough. For every time the game resets with the text, "The end is never the end" in the loading screen. This recurring imagery also occurs when you first boot up the game. The game utilizes Muson Abraham in the loading screen to subtly foreshadow the game's recurring elements. Sarian describes this idea as creating a sense of entrapment to both the narrator and Stanley, particularly when the narrator forcefully resets the game.
Oh, I can't take this anymore, to hell with it. Restart.
The coexistence of both characters defines the entire premise of the game, alongside the usage of cycles with laces of existentialism. The player is encouraged to create their own interpretations out of the game, which employs the tropes of the theatre of the absurd. Therefore, by employing tropes associated with this dramatic element, the game creates a form of existential philosophy that encourages multiple approaches to reading the text. This approach of creating multiple interpretations shine through the game's meta-humor and ficta meta-referencing to create a paradoxical analysis of the linear structure of video games.
You're not Stanley. You're a real person. I can't believe I was so mistaken. This is why you've been able to make correct and incorrect choices.
The game's confusion ending directly examines the absurdist nature of video game linearity. This ficta meta-reference has the narrator, frustrated and confused with the story structure he has planned out, alongside with the player not following his instructions, creating an adventure line to guide the player on track. However, this eventually goes astray, leading to the confusion ending, making the narrator and the player realize the predetermined nature of the story. The creation of the adventure line is clearly depicted with yellow paint, which functions as a humorous parody of the constant use of yellow paint in video games to guide players to the correct path. Examples of this trope in modern video games being Resident Evil 4 Remake and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth.
You still holding up okay?
Yeah, feeling great actually. Could do this all day.
The narrator's self-awareness of the adventure line allows the game to comment on the nature of free will in video games. Linear game design always focuses on a predetermined destination, even when sometimes given the illusion of choice. The confusion ending discusses the limitations of this linear path by having the narrator reject the predetermined outcome of the story in an attempt to gain his own free will.
That's really how all this goes? It's all determined? So now, according to the schedule, I restart again. Then what? Am I just supposed to forget? Well, what if I don't want to forget? Why don't I get to decide? Though they're always saying that life is about the journey and not the destination, so I hope that's where we are right now.
The narrator's comments on predetermination functions as a critique on the restrictions of video game linearity through direct meta-referencing, therefore deliberating the limitations of linear story-driven games. However, the game also creates a contradiction through the narrator's response to linear game design. The narrator also expresses his genuine discontent for open-ended gameplay through indirect, extra-compositional meta-references. In the original 2013 release, the game's ending, also known as the playtest ending, has the player humorously test the narrator's new game, a baby you must prevent reaching the fire by pressing one button. However, he describes that to understand the game's true meaning, the player must play this game for 4 hours. Failing to do so will frustrate him into playing other games such as Minecraft in the 2013 release and Firewatch in the Ultra Deluxe edition.
It is. It's an open world game. Good God, quickly block it off. Oh, thank goodness, Stanley. What a close call. You really wandered off into that thing.
This results in the narrator expressing his displeasure at the open-ended structure of both titles. This paradox of freedom, in contrast to the confusion ending, is paramount to the concept of theatre of the absurd, as it signifies the idea that the game offers differing conceptions surrounding freedom through the game's multiple endings. Thus, by creating a paradox to the narrator's philosophy on freedom, it highlights the absurdist nature of structure in video games through the theatre of the absurd. This paradoxical outlook of the game is supported in another journal article by Fen Zhu, who argues that by giving the player a lack of agency in the game's choices, and by denying the possibility of any kind of player freedom and meaningfulness of in-game choices, contributing to this lack of player independence, the player is forced to undergo their own interpretation as to what freedom truly entails. This is further enhanced by the bomb ending, where the narrator openly mocks the player's persistence to continue to avert death of themselves.
Or did you just assume when you saw that timer that something in this room was capable of turning it off? Everything, anything, something here will save me. Why would you think that, Stanley? That this video game can be beaten? Won? Solved? Do you have any idea what your purpose in this place is?
Zhu also acknowledges that this scenario acts as a mockery of the player's delusions of their casual power, as gaming has the ability to allow the player agency to make change within choice-based video games. The Stanley Parable completely ignores this fundamental aspect of choice, which in turn creates the ability to question at what capacity the player can have to make meaningful choices in video games as a medium. Thus, the game acts as a critique of how choice is presented in video games. After all, how can freedom be achieved in video games so long as the game is programmed to reach a predetermined destination, even when the choice of the player is always heading towards an already situated outcome? The Stanley Parable does not have a direct answer to these questions. However, Sarian describes that this allows the player to form a self-reflective answer for themselves by making the player understand how their choices allow them to better understand the role that they play in games. By understanding the paradoxes that are entrenched in the game's structure and writing, the Stanley Parable invites the player to better understand the power and limitations that choice can bring to the form of interactive art. Another element that the Stanley Parable discusses is the industry practices of sequels, unfinished games, and diminishing the original meaning of the text. The Ultra Deluxe Edition from 2022 includes a brand new portion of the game titled New Content, which simply consists of a jump button at the dismay of the narrator.
That's it? Oh, you've got to be kidding me. You see, Stanley? And don't get me started on the level of craftsmanship that's gone into it. In fact, I'm looking right now at the game's achievements, and it's hard to believe one of them actually says, "Test achievement, please ignore."
He humorously uses direct meta-references to the game itself by creating an exhibit looking into the past of the Stanley Parable as a game, its awards, cultural impact, and the game's Steam reviews.
Honestly, I could not be bothered to play this game to full completion. The narrator is obnoxious and unfunny. Unfunny!
The narrator creates an exhibit to sell the idea of a fully fledged sequel, amusingly overselling the importance of it being named the Stanley Parable 2.
Calling it the Stanley Parable 2 is just so much catchier than Ultra Deluxe, don't you think? Ultra Deluxe? What does it even mean? But the Stanley Parable 2, now that's an artistic statement right there.
With only incremental improvements such as the game being able to say the player's name, which humorously only says Jim.
Jim.
The narrator comments that it'll be better for people.
I suppose I could allow only people named Jim to play the Stanley Parable 2. That would actually save me the work of finishing this feature.
The narrator's comment on giving an incomplete feature to the finished product is reminiscent of the common industry practice of releasing unfinished games, a practice becoming more and more relevant since the title's original release in 2013, where games such as Overwatch 2's incomplete campaign mode and Battlefield 2042's lackluster launch being the most prominent modern examples of this industry trend. The unfinished state of the sequel is supported in the epilogue, where it is revealed that the Stanley Parable 2 receives extremely poor reception. Therefore, the narrator's willingness to leave several features of the sequel incomplete functions as a commentary on the releasing of unfinished games. Furthermore, a second concept that the narrator introduces is the Reassurance Bucket to counter the game's paradoxical nature. This acts as a statement on how corporate meddling significantly diminishes the meaning of the original work for a mass market audience. The narrator describes that the Reassurance Bucket is better than fixing the game's paradoxical nature as,
And to be honest, it's a much more convenient solution for me than actually redesigning the game to be less uncomfortable. Can you imagine what a pain in the ass that would be?
the game uses these explicit meta-references to comment on how the industry diminishes art that is abstract and open to interpretation, in favor of simplifying the game's message. Consequently, commenting on the industry practices of unnecessary sequels, incomplete features, and dumbing down the game's messaging for a mass market audience.
As long as you hold on to the bucket, the many disorienting contradictions of the Stanley Parable will feel perfectly normal and perhaps even comforting.
The Stanley Parable utilizes the theatre of the absurd to encourage the player to create their own interpretation of the game's paradoxical nature on choice. The game uses this contradiction of narrative structure to examine whether the player truly has freedom in a choice-based game. Through the use of explicit meta-commentary and extra-compositional meta-references, the game examines the limitations of story-driven linear games. Simultaneously critiquing the video game industry's practices surrounding sequels, unfinished games, and purposefully removing abstraction from video games to appeal to a mass market audience.